The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's Hospital in San Diego cast harsh shadows across the vinyl floors that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, a chemical bite that never quite faded no matter how many times you passed through the emergency department doors. Megan O'Brien moved through her rounds with quiet efficiency, her hand steady as she documented medication times and dosages with the kind of meticulous attention that made her stand out among the nursing staff, not in a way that drew applause, but in a way that drew scrutiny. 3 months. She'd been on the 4th floor for 3 months, watching billing codes that didn't match procedures, tracking pharmaceutical orders that exceeded patient census by 23%, documenting discrepancies in veteran-patient files that pointed to something systemic and deliberate. Her left hand trembled slightly when she held charts against the light, a neurological artifact from the IED in Tikrit 7 years ago, but only visible in certain angles. Most people never noticed. Dr. Whitfield noticed everything. The challenge coin sat in her locker, tarnished silver the color of old storm clouds, pressed into her palm by Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen in a Humvee heading back from a patrol near the Jolin district. That coin had meant something then. A promise. A debt. A reminder that some people carried pieces of you forward even when you couldn't carry them yourself. She touched it before every shift, the way some nurses touched crucifixes or lucky stones. It was her tether to why she was here, why she'd walked away from a secured position with Naval Intelligence Field Operations to work a civilian nursing floor under a borrowed identity that had to withstand scrutiny. The hospital was the wire. The pharmaceutical diversion was the catch. And room for 47 was the reason nobody could ever know her real name. The door to 447 stood open as she approached, and Megan could hear the faint mechanical rhythm of the ventilator, that soft wheeze that had become as familiar as her own breathing after 72 hours of observation. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen lay in the hospital bed with his left forearm exposed, and on that forearm, inked in faded block letters that had started to blur at the edges, was M. O'Brien. The tattoo had been applied in a field aid station after she'd carried him 3 miles through sniper fire, his leg hemorrhaging faster than plasma could replace it, his voice already slurring from blood loss and shock. He'd asked the medic for a needle and ink. He'd asked for her name. She didn't know why at the time. She understood now, or thought she did, that when you're certain you're about to die, you mark what matters. You leave proof that something happened. That someone mattered. When she checked his vitals that first week back in his room, he stared through her like she was part of the hospital's infrastructure. A monitor. A valve. A machine that delivered medications on schedule. The traumatic brain injury had erased everything, the convoy, the IED, the 3 miles through fire, her voice calling his name to keep him conscious. It had erased her face entirely. But it hadn't erased the tattoo, and that was the cruelest mathematics of the human body. His muscle memory could spell her name, but his mind couldn't attach a face to those letters anymore. She wondered if that counted as mercy. The pulse oximeter clipped to his index finger showed 94% saturation. Blood pressure 118/76. Temperature 37.2 Celsius. All stable. All monitored. All documented in the chart with timestamps that established her presence on the floor at specific intervals, which was part of the cover, a floor nurse who checked on patients meticulously, who asked questions about medications, who seemed almost obsessed with verifying that treatments matched diagnoses. No one in a hospital questions excessive diligence. Diligence looks like care. Diligence looks like commitment. Diligence looks innocent. She was in the middle of her third circuit through the floor when Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway of room for 47, his presence shifting the air pressure the way a storm system moves in from offshore. He was a tall man with the kind of tailored cologne that announced him before he was visible, expensive aftershave that smelled like leather and vetiver, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who had authority over him. His eyes tracked Megan's movements with the slow intensity of someone studying a problem he intended to solve. She felt it. That specific weight of observation. That moment when a hunter realizes something isn't quite right with the prey. "You're spending a lot of time with this patient, Ms. O'Brien," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the kind of casual contempt that didn't need to be loud to be effective. The words themselves did the work. His tone just made sure everyone heard the implication. He was studying the medication chart in her hands, and she watched his eyes move across her handwriting, the precise documentation of time and dosage, the cross-references she'd made between the prescribed amounts and the amounts the pharmacy had actually dispensed. Uninsured, correct? Disabled veteran, Megan said, keeping her voice soft and deferential, the way a floor nurse speaks to a physician, respectful, slightly apologetic for existing in the same room. Marine. Multiple combat injuries. I want to make sure he's comfortable. Whitfield smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes. Comfort is expensive. The hospital doesn't make money on comfort. It makes money on efficiency. He handed the chart back to her without looking at her face. Check the billing codes. Make sure they align with what's actually happening here. Wouldn't want any discrepancies creating paperwork problems. The way he said discrepancies hung in the air like a threat. Like he knew she was looking. Like he knew and didn't care because he had insurance policies and connections that made internal audits inconvenient obstacles rather than actual dangers. Megan nodded, saying nothing. Silence was safer. Silence couldn't be quoted in a meeting. Silence couldn't be used as evidence of anything except professional composure. She'd learned that early in her career, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is talk back. Sometimes survival means becoming invisible. Whitfield lingered in the doorway for another 17 seconds, she counted, a habit from her intelligence background, before he turned and walked back into the corridor. His footsteps echoed on the tile floor, the sound of expensive Italian leather against hospital vinyl, moving with the confidence of someone who owned the building. Not technically, but effectively. That was the real power in institutions like this. You didn't need to own the building. You just needed enough people in administration to owe you favors, enough pharmaceutical representatives returning your calls, enough colleagues who'd learned that staying quiet kept their salaries safe. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at the nurse's station during the daily briefing, when the entire floor had gathered for shift handoff and Dr. Whitfield decided to make a point. He was standing near the central monitor, the one that displayed vital signs for all 16 patients on the 4th floor, when he'd pulled his wallet out and extracted a $50 bill. $50. He held it up so everyone could see it, his gold wedding band catching the fluorescent light. I'm giving this to anyone who can correctly predict how long the new nurse on my floor will last, he announced, his voice carrying that same casual cruelty. I'm thinking 1 week. Maybe less. I give her until Friday. He looked directly at Megan, standing 3 feet away, restocking the medication cart. What do you think, Ms. O'Brien? Can you make it through a full week without deciding this job is beneath you? The room went completely silent. The kind of silence that happens when everyone holds their breath at exactly the same moment. The ventilator in room for 12 wheezed its mechanical rhythm down the hallway. Someone's for pump beeped softly. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric song. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Megan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her hands remained steady as she counted out the medications in front of her, 1 packet, 2 packets, 3 packets of saline flushes. Her face was a perfect mask of professional indifference, never meeting his eyes, never acknowledging the $50 bill or the implication that she was temporary, that she was a line item waiting to be crossed out of the budget. The trembling in her left hand that sometimes appeared under stress didn't come. Muscle memory. Combat training. 7 years of learning how to keep her face neutral when someone was trying to break it. What Whitfield didn't know, what nobody on that floor knew, was that she'd been broken before, in ways that made his contempt look like compliments. She'd been shot twice. She'd lost 18 people in her unit. She'd made decisions in Tikrit that still visited her in the hours before dawn. A $50 bet and some public humiliation registered on her threat assessment like a pebble landing on concrete. Significant only if you were the pebble. She finished restocking the cart in methodical silence and moved to the next station, her movements precise and economical, every gesture communicating absolute professional focus. Someone else laughed nervously, a nervous reaction to the tension. Nobody else said anything. They'd all learned the same lesson that morning: challenging Whitfield publicly was not a survivable decision. Megan made a note on her phone, the tiny device she carried specifically for documenting observations: WF public humiliation, 08 for 7 hours, $50 bet tenure prediction, staff present 16, no intervention from charge nurse. The words went into a secure encrypted folder that synchronized with a naval intelligence server every 4 hours. Every insult, every discrepancy, every pharmaceutical order that didn't add up, it was all going into a file that would eventually be read by people with authority that made hospital administrators look like administrative assistants. But she couldn't think about that. Not yet. Not while she was standing in a room full of people who thought she was just a floor nurse trying to keep a job. She moved into room for 51 to check on a post-surgical patient, and as she worked through the vitals and the dressing changes, her mind was already 3 moves ahead. Whitfield had shown his hand by showing concern about her documentation. That meant he'd noticed she was watching. That meant he was worried enough to escalate, not to actual violence or serious threats, just this social theater of a $50 bet and public mockery. It was stage 1 of a predictable pattern. The antagonist always believed they could control the narrative through shame and social pressure. The antagonist always believed their position was unassailable. She'd seen it before. Different hospitals, different antagonists, always the same calculation. And she'd learned long ago that the quietly competent person with nothing to lose was actually the most dangerous person in any room. The challenge coin was still in her pocket when her shift ended at 1900 hours. She touched it as she changed out of her scrubs, there in the locker room alone, and she thought about Marcus Chen staring at her tattoo without recognition, and she thought about why she'd come to St. Michael's in the first place, and she thought about what would happen when everything that was hidden finally came to light. But for now, she just had to wait. She just had to keep watching. She just had to hold her composure while a mediocre physician in an expensive suit tried to convince everyone she was temporary. She was going to prove him right about one thing: she wouldn't last a week. She was going to outlast everyone. The cafeteria fell silent the moment the tray hit the floor. Turkey sandwich spinning. Apple rolling like a grenade. Plastic utensils scattering across tile in that way things do when gravity wins, sudden, inevitable, witnessed. Megan O'Brien stood frozen for exactly 1 second, watching food she hadn't eaten yet become evidence of humiliation, and that was when Dr. Whitfield stood from his table with the deliberate slowness of a man who wanted maximum audience. The room held its breath. 40 people. Maybe more. All of them watching. He bumped her elbow as he passed, hard enough that physics did the rest. Hard enough that it couldn't have been accidental. The kind of calculated violence that lives in plausible deniability, just a doctor walking by too close, not his fault she was standing there, not his fault gravity existed. His smile said otherwise. His eyes said he'd been planning this moment since 2 a.m. when she'd been photographing medication orders in the Martin Luther King Jr. wing. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the line at the register to hear. Loud enough for the kitchen staff visible through the service window to hear. He bent and tossed a patient chart at her feet, a thick one, Marcus Chen's chart, pulled from somewhere on his person like a conjuring trick. "While you're down there, check if you missed anything else today. I counted 3 charting errors from you this morning." There had been no charting errors. Megan knelt. The floor was still damp from morning mopping. She smelled bleach and something metallic underneath it, maybe just the ghost of 1,000 meals spilled and cleaned and forgotten. Her hands moved with the steady precision of someone trained to function in worse circumstances than a scattered lunch tray. 1 piece at a time. Turkey sandwich. The apple, it had rolled under a chair and she reached for it without hesitation, without the smallest tremor in her fingers. A younger nurse, Rodriguez, the one from obstetrics, made a move to help, but Whitfield waved her off with the casual authority of someone who'd never questioned his right to orchestrate public humiliation. "Let her handle her own mess," he said. "She needs to learn." Megan didn't meet his eyes. Didn't acknowledge the words. Didn't let her breathing change. This was a technique mastered in places that didn't appear on any organizational chart, a monastery of discipline taught in combat zones where the cost of visible anger was measured in body bags. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the difference between a Master Chief Petty Officer and a civilian woman in scrubs, a chasm she could close in seconds if the rules allowed it, if 15 years of service and 3 Purple Hearts weren't sitting in a file folder that would dissolve like paper in rain if she broke character now. She gathered everything. The chart went last, she balanced it on top of the recovered food, stood with her tray reassembled like a puzzle missing most of its pieces, and walked to the trash can without a word. Without a look backward. The room exhaled only after she disappeared around the corner toward the hallway. Whitfield returned to his table. Someone laughed nervously. The cafeteria resumed its rhythm, conversations restarting like engines that had stalled. By the time Megan reached the stairwell, the moment had already calcified into hospital legend, another new nurse learning the cost of asking too many questions, another reminder that some hierarchies couldn't be challenged without consequences. That evening he cornered her outside the medication room on the 4th floor. The hallway was empty except for the sound of a ventilator wheeze from a nearby patient room, mechanical and patient as a sleeping animal. Whitfield moved like a man practicing civility for an audience that wasn't there, his voice dropping into that particular register doctors used when they wanted to sound concerned while delivering threats. "You ask too many questions about billing codes, O'Brien," he said. "Not an accusation. A statement of fact. An observation. Patients get treated. Insurance gets billed. Hospital gets paid. It's not complicated unless you make it complicated." She stood with her medication cart between them, a barrier of pharmacy bottles and syringes and liquid evidence she would later understand was poison wearing a legitimate prescription label. "Nurses who make things complicated don't last here." He smiled. Not the smile from the cafeteria, that had been a predator's smile, all teeth and conquest. This smile was almost warm. Almost paternal. "Are we clear?" "Understood, doctor," she said. Deference in her voice. Submission in her posture. Everything a man like Whitfield needed to see to believe he'd won. She walked away before he could respond, and she felt his eyes on her back like a laser sight, felt the weight of his satisfaction at her compliance, at the apparent breaking of something that had looked briefly like it might resist. He didn't realize what he was actually looking at, not submission but strategy, not defeat but documentation. She'd already photographed his handwriting on the medication orders. Already traced the pattern of dosage changes that corresponded to billing code inflation. Already sent encrypted messages to her naval intelligence handler at the intelligence community facility in Suitland, Maryland, the one that didn't officially exist and didn't answer to the normal chain of command. By Monday morning, 3 federal agencies had Chen's file flagged for investigation. By Monday afternoon, Whitfield had noticed. He reassigned Chen during rounds with the casual precision of a man moving chess pieces. Megan watched from the doorway of another patient's room as he directed a med student to update the board. "Patterson will be handling 447 from now on. O'Brien, you're spread too thin on the veteran cases. We need distribution of your attention across the floor." She opened her mouth to object. Chen was her responsibility, her documentation, her proof, but Whitfield cut her off before the first word escaped. "That's not a request." By evening shift she'd been rotated to the opposite wing. Same floor, different patients, impossible distance from the man whose tattoo carried her name like a ghost that couldn't quite remember who it had belonged to. The shift supervisor had looked apologetic. "Dr. Whitfield's orders. He says you need experience in pulmonary cases." She'd nodded. Accepted. Smiled a tight smile that said she understood the rules and wasn't going to fight them. At 9 p.m. her phone buzzed. A text from the evening charge nurse. "Patterson called in sick. Chen's alone on 4. Someone needs to check vitals at 21:30. Megan sat in her car in the parking lot for 6 minutes after her shift ended, watching the hospital lights blur in the rain that had started falling sometime between medication passes and charting. The challenge coin was in her locker upstairs, wrapped in the same plastic bag where she kept it when she wasn't alone in the apartment staring at it like it might hold answers. She'd carried it since Tikrit. Carried it through the surgery. Carried it through the recovery where Marcus Chen had looked at her the same way he looked at every unfamiliar face, with the polite distance of a man whose brain had been rewritten by blast pressure and whose memories had been filed in a cabinet someone had locked and then lost the key to. The coin was tarnished. She'd never polished it. Some part of her believed the tarnish was honest, that keeping it damaged was the only way to keep it real, keep it true to what it actually represented, which was a promise made to a man who could no longer remember making it, by a woman who'd carried him 3 miles through sniper fire while his blood soaked through her uniform and his voice kept calling her name the way it was tattooed on his arm, permanent and present and utterly inaccessible. She sat in the rain-dark car and thought about what her handler had said, 72 hours to document the full scope of the diversion ring. 72 hours to build the case that would put Whitfield in federal prison. 72 hours before something would give, before someone would crack, before the mathematics of revenge and justice would finally balance into something that looked like completion. But Chen was alone on floor 4. Chen had been reassigned away from her. And the medication orders sitting in the pharmacy system had been changed in ways that nobody but someone trained to read 3 layers of deception would notice. She pulled the keys from the ignition. The rain hammered against the windshield like applause. She had 7 more hours until her mandatory break ended and she could legally return to the hospital. 7 hours to sit with the challenge coin and think about the cost of promises that survived beyond memory, beyond recognition, beyond any possibility of redemption. But that wasn't the worst part. Her phone buzzed at 2:14 a.m. on Sunday. Unknown number. The kind of call that didn't come through civilian networks. Megan sat up in her apartment, the challenge coin still warm in her palm from hours of turning it over and over. The voice on the other end was clipped, efficient, no greeting necessary. We have confirmation. The pharmaceutical diversion traces directly to Whitfield. He's been altering dosages on high-value insurance cases for 18 months. We need documentation. We need him on record. She didn't ask how they'd gotten this far. That wasn't her question to ask. The disabled veteran patients, the handler continued. Marcus Chen isn't the only one. We've identified 7 others with similar dosage patterns. Chen's case is the cleanest. His chart shows a clear escalation over the past 3 weeks. If we can prove Whitfield doubled his cardiac medication to inflate billing codes, we have him on fraud and reckless endangerment. Megan's jaw tightened. 7 patients. 7 lives put at risk because a doctor was padding invoices. You're reassigned from his care, the handler said. Which means Whitfield thinks you're neutralized. He'll be careless now. He'll assume the investigation is over. You need to get back into Chen's rotation. Document everything. The next dose alteration is your evidence. The line went dead. She sat in the darkness of her apartment, the rain hammering against the windows like someone trying to get in. The challenge coin caught the streetlight filtering through the blinds. In Tikrit, Marcus had pressed it into her hand before the patrol. It was tarnished then, a piece of shrapnel fused to copper, something he'd carried through 2 tours. In case you don't make it back, he'd said, grinning like it was a joke. She'd made it back. She'd carried him 3 miles through sniper fire with that coin pressed against her ribs. And now he didn't know her name. But Whitfield had just handed her everything she needed. By Monday morning, Megan had her assignment changed back. A simple request to the floor supervisor. She was more experienced with post-operative monitoring, and Marcus needed someone familiar with his cardiac history. No alarm bells. No red flags. Just routine staffing optimization. The supervisor approved it without checking anything beyond her credentials. Marcus was asleep when she checked his chart at 10:15 p.m. that Tuesday. His vitals were stable. His medications were listed on the nursing schedule, 3 p.m. dose completed without incident. The next administration was scheduled for 11 p.m. Megan pulled up the dosage record and felt her stomach drop. The cardiac medication was listed at double the prescribed amount. Whitfield had signed off on it at 9:38 p.m., just 90 minutes ago. She ran. The monitor alarm screamed before she reached his room, a sound like a siren buried in the walls. Megan moved through the hallways with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd trained for this exact moment, pushing through the door to find Marcus's body rigid, his back arched, his left arm flailing as seizures ripped through his nervous system. His lips were the color of storm clouds. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 68, 64. 59. The on-call resident was already there, fumbling with the defibrillator pads, her hand shaking as she tried to get them to stick to his sweat-soaked chest. "I've got it," Megan said. Not a request. A command. She hit the code button. The overhead intercom crackled, "Code blue, room for 47. Code blue, room for 47. Rubber gloves snapped like gunshots in the silence. The crash cart was already rolling toward them, but what Megan saw on the monitor made her blood run cold. Ventricular fibrillation. His heart was in chaos. The defibrillator pads wouldn't work fast enough. CPR wouldn't generate enough circulation. He had maybe 4 minutes before his brain began to die. She didn't hesitate. The scalpel from the crash cart was cold against her palm. She made a single precise incision between his ribs, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 training scenarios that had never mattered until right now. The rib spreader opened his chest like a door. His heart was visible, twitching uselessly in its cage of bone and muscle. Whitfield arrived at the moment her hands went inside his chest. "What are you doing?" His voice was loud. Shocked. Megan didn't answer. She didn't have the luxury of explanations. Her fingers found the left ventricle, and she began direct cardiac massage, a fist-sized organ pressed between her palms, compressed and released, compressed and released. Her voice cut through the code team's paralysis with command authority that no floor nurse should possess. Epi. 1 milligram, for push. Push it now. The resident's hands moved. Ventilate at 100. Clear his airway. The respiratory tech obeyed without question. Something in Megan's voice made obedience the only option. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. We're running a rapid infuser for volume." The monitor showed flat line. No electrical activity. Just the flat line of a heart that had surrendered. Megan compressed harder. Her hands were steady. Her voice was calm. This was the thing that separated the people who saved lives from the people who watched them slip away, the ability to be ice while everything around her burned. Again. Epi again. Come on, Marcus. Come on. He'd carried her 3 miles through sniper fire. His left arm bearing her name like a tattoo was a promise that didn't survive traumatic brain injury, but his heart was still trying. It just needed someone to remind it how. At 3 minutes and 42 seconds, she felt a flutter. Just a tremor. Just the ghost of a heartbeat. She compressed again. The monitor blipped. 1 beat. 2 beats. The rhythm climbed from the flat line into something almost organized. "We have a pulse," the resident whispered. Megan kept her hands moving. "Close the chest. Number 0 silk on a tapered needle. Move." She glanced at Whitfield once. His face had gone pale. His expression shifted from shock to something colder, calculation. He was already thinking about damage control. For minutes and 12 seconds. That was how long Marcus Chen's heart had stopped beating. That was how long Megan had held his life between her hands, literally, while the rest of the code team scrambled to remember how to do their jobs. When she finally stepped back, her scrubs were soaked in blood to her elbows. The surgical gloves were dark red. Her hands were shaking, but the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the physical manifestation of combat training that had turned her into something that could crack a man's chest with a scalpel and keep her voice level the entire time. Whitfield was already on his phone in the hallway. She could see him through the window, his mouth moving rapidly, his free hand gesturing like he was painting a picture of the situation. By the time they had Marcus stabilized and transferred to the ICU, she'd already been paged to the administration office. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing exactly what Whitfield was doing. He wasn't panicking. He was strategizing. One phone call to a board member who benefited from his kickback scheme. Another to the chief of staff, reminding him about the consulting contract his wife held with one of Whitfield's pharmaceutical partners. A third to the private investigator, accelerating whatever he'd already started digging into her background. By 6 a.m. she was standing outside the hospital, watching the sun rise over San Diego, knowing that her cover wasn't just compromised. It was about to be blown to pieces. Whitfield had seen her work. He'd seen the calm precision of someone trained for emergency medicine at a level that no floor nurse in a civilian hospital should possess. He'd seen the authority in her voice, the command presence that had made a terrified resident follow orders without question. He'd seen enough to know she wasn't what she claimed to be. And he had the resources to prove it. By 6 a.m., before the hospital morning shift even began, Dr. Whitfield had already made 7 phone calls. The first was to Richard Hayes, the board chairman who'd been taking kickbacks from Whitfield's pharmaceutical scheme for 3 years, $40,000 a month, reliable as a pension. Hayes answered on the second ring. "We have a problem," Whitfield said, his voice steady but carrying an edge like a blade finding bone. "The nurse from last night. The one who saved Chen." 60 seconds of explanation. Hayes understood immediately. The second call went to Dr. Patricia Montoya, chief of staff, who owed Whitfield a favor from when he'd covered for her during her DUI arrest in 2019, testified to the hospital board that she'd been at a medical conference, not 3 sheets deep at a downtown bar. "Terminate her," Whitfield said. "Patient safety violation. She performed a procedure outside her scope. Not a request. A directive." He made the third call to a private investigator named Derek Crane, the kind of man who kept files on half of San Diego's medical establishment and sold information like most people sold insurance. "I need everything," Whitfield told him. "Background, credentials, employment history. Especially anything that doesn't match. I'll pay double. $5,000 upfront, another $5,000 when Crane had something actionable." The fourth call was harder, riskier, to his contact at Mercer Pharmaceuticals, the company that had been padding his bank account for altering dosages on Medicare patients. "The situation may be compromised," he said carefully, using the language they'd established years ago. "One of the nurses may have noticed irregularities." By 8 a.m., Whitfield's network was already moving. Files were being pulled, records flagged for administrative review, and Crane's office was digging into Megan O'Brien's past with the kind of intensity usually reserved for counterintelligence investigations. Whitfield didn't know why yet, didn't know that her civilian nursing credentials were airtight because the Navy itself had fabricated them, but he knew something was wrong. The way she'd moved during the code. The precision. The authority in her voice when she'd barked orders at a room full of physicians. That wasn't a floor nurse. That was military protocol. By noon, Megan was being escorted from the hospital by security. The cardboard box held everything from her locker, scrubs, a stethoscope, the tarnished challenge coin she kept in her back pocket, her employee badge with her photograph and the fake civilian name that was no longer valid. The security guard, a young man named Torres who'd been nothing but kind to her, wouldn't meet her eyes as he walked her to the administrative office. Chief of Staff Montoya sat behind her desk, papers arranged like evidence. "Patient safety is our primary concern, Ms. O'Brien," she said, reading from a script Whitfield had obviously written. "We've received a complaint regarding an authorized practice during the code blue last night. Direct cardiac massage is a physician-level procedure. You have no authorization for advanced interventions." Megan stood with the box balanced against her chest. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't shake. She looked at Montoya the way someone looks at a restaurant server who's brought the wrong order, neutral, professional, already moving on. "I understand," she said quietly. You're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. The words hung in the air like smoke. Whitfield had been systematic and thorough, activating his network like a chess player moving pieces into position, and Megan understood immediately what had happened. The private investigator would find inconsistencies in her background, because there were inconsistencies, by design. Her naval service record didn't match her civilian employment. Her medical certifications were real, but her nursing license came through channels that wouldn't withstand scrutiny. If she pushed back, if she tried to defend herself, she'd have to reveal why a decorated military operative was working an undercover nursing job, and that meant blowing the entire naval intelligence operation before she'd gathered enough evidence to move against Whitfield's entire network. The pharmaceutical company connections. The board member payoffs. The pattern of overdoses on veteran patients that stretched back 7 years. She walked through the lobby while staff whispered. Phones were already out, people already texting about the nurse getting walked out by security, the mystery firing, the rumors. Whitfield stood in his office doorway on the 3rd floor, watching her go, and through the window Megan could see him shredding documents, his hands working steadily, feeding paper into the machine in slow, deliberate strips. He'd already begun sanitizing the records. Every altered dosage would be rewritten. Every kickback would be explained as consulting fees. By the time federal investigators arrived, if they arrived, there would be nothing left but Megan's word against his, and her word was compromised because she couldn't even prove who she really was without destroying the operation. At 3 a.m., she sat alone in a diner on El Cajon Boulevard called Rosita's, the kind of place where the coffee was strong enough to strip enamel and nobody asked questions about the hollow-eyed woman staring at nothing. Her coffee had gone cold in a chipped mug, the surface slick with film. The challenge coin sat on the Formica table in front of her, the one Chen had pressed into her palm in Tikrit 7 years ago, before the IED, before his traumatic brain injury had rewritten his entire life. Before she'd carried him 3 miles through sniper fire with rounds tearing up the street around them, before his left arm had gotten that tattoo with her name, before he'd forgotten her completely. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, cheekbones too sharp, eyes with the kind of shadow that came from knowing too much. The diner was empty except for the cook in the back, the hum of the refrigerator, the fluorescent hum overhead. Rain hammered the parking lot outside like applause for something she hadn't done. She'd saved his life. She'd broken every protocol, every chain of command, and performed an emergency procedure that should have been outside her scope because watching him die while following rules would have been worse than burning her entire operation. And in saving Marcus Chen, she destroyed the investigation before she could prove a single thing against Whitfield. He knew someone was watching now. The private investigator would find nothing, her cover was airtight, but Whitfield didn't need proof. He just needed to create enough doubt to force her out, and he'd done it in 12 hours. The cardboard box sat on the chair across from her. Inside it, a stethoscope, some scrubs, a badge that was no longer valid. The coin sat cold under her fingertips. She'd moved into St. Michael's 3 months ago with a fully documented civilian identity, established medical credentials, a backstory that would withstand routine questioning. She'd been prepared to spend 6 months, a year if necessary, building the case slowly, documenting everything, gathering evidence against Whitfield's network until she had them all, the board members, the pharmaceutical representatives, the hospital administrators who'd looked the other way. Now all of that was gone. The evidence she'd photographed was incomplete. The contacts she'd made were severed. The access she'd cultivated was locked down. And Marcus Chen was alive on the 4th floor, which meant her entire painful sacrifice hadn't been meaningless, but it also meant she'd traded the mission for one man's life, and she couldn't even be sure if she'd made the right choice. She ordered another coffee she wouldn't drink. The server, an older woman named Rosa with tired eyes and kind hands, didn't ask what was wrong. She just refilled the cup and left Megan alone with the tarnished coin and the weight of 7 years of compartmentalization crumbling like a building in a controlled demolition. By dawn, Derek Crane's investigation would hit a wall. Megan's credentials were real because the Navy doesn't file fake documents, but Whitfield wouldn't care. He'd already won. He'd pushed her out. He'd broken her cover. He'd protected himself. The pharmaceutical fraud would continue. The overdoses would continue. The disabled veterans would continue dying from doses adjusted upward for billing fraud, and she would be sitting in a diner with a cold cup of coffee and a tarnished coin, wondering if she'd just compromised the entire investigation for one man whose name was tattooed on her arm and who'd forgotten her face. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects dying slowly. Rain kept falling. Somewhere in the darkness between 3 a.m. and dawn, the city shifted and nothing would ever be the same. But Megan didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know that the Navy didn't send undercover operatives into hostile territory and then abandon them when cover was blown. She didn't know that her commanding officer at Naval Intelligence had been monitoring the investigation the entire time, watching Whitfield's network expand, waiting for the moment when the threat was documented enough to move on. She didn't know that the Marine Corps doesn't forget its own, and that 300 miles north at Camp Lejeune, a two-star general had received the call at 2:16 a.m. informing him that one of his most decorated officers was being terminated for essentially saving a disabled veteran's life. The rotor wash hit the parking lot at 0800 sharp. 3 Hums pulled through the main entrance of St. Michael's Hospital, their tires hissing against wet asphalt from the pre-dawn rain, and a UH-60M Black Hawk descended with the precision of a surgeon's hand, its rotors shaking the windows of the emergency department. The landing skids touched concrete. Armed Marines in dress uniforms exited in formation, their boots striking the tile with the cadence of a drum line, and they moved directly toward the administrative wing. Their leader, a major with shoulders like a linebacker, stepped up to the security desk and asked for one person. "We're here for Chief O'Brien." Call sign Ironside. "Where is she?" The elderly security guard, himself a Navy veteran who'd spent 3 years on an amphibious assault ship in 1987, looked at the major's face, then at the photo being handed across the desk. His skin went the color of old parchment. He stood very slowly. "Master Chief Petty Officer," he whispered, but not quietly enough. The lobby was crowded, families waiting for visiting hours, staff crossing paths, administrators reviewing charts, and his voice carried like a struck bell. Heads turned. A nurse dropping off paperwork froze mid-motion. The receptionist's fingers stopped moving on her keyboard. 30 seconds of silence stretched into an hour. Word rippled through the hospital in concentric circles. "Master Chief." That nurse. The one Whitfield fired. Megan appeared in the lobby wearing civilian clothes, dark jeans, a charcoal hoodie, her service shoes polished to a mirror shine. She didn't acknowledge the stares or the whispers. She simply walked toward the major and stood at a modified position of attention, her hands relaxed at her sides, her face the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. The major saluted. She returned it. Then he handed her a folder and began reading aloud, his voice pitched to carry through the entire lobby so that every staff member, every visitor, every person who had witnessed her humiliation in the cafeteria and her termination in the hallway could hear exactly who they'd been working beside for the last 3 months. "Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien," he announced. 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star for Valor in Tikrit, 2011. 15 years Naval Intelligence. Current assignment, monitoring healthcare fraud targeting disabled veterans. He paused. The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz above them. "Operative O'Brien, your cover is now compromised. You are officially relieved of undercover assignment effective immediately and reinstated to active duty status." He handed her a replacement badge, not a nursing credential but a Naval Intelligence investigator's ID with her photograph and her real rank printed in gold letters. The entire lobby had gone completely still. 3 nurses stood frozen holding patient charts. An orderly had stopped pushing a medication cart. A visitor in the waiting area had lowered their phone. That was when Dr. Whitfield appeared at the far end of the corridor. He'd been in his office, had probably heard the helicopter, had certainly heard the commotion in the administrative wing, and his face was the color of spoiled milk. He stopped moving. His hand went to his pocket. His eyes moved from the major to Megan to the federal agents now entering the lobby wearing jackets marked with letters so large they could be read from the 3rd floor, FBI. NCIS. His network wasn't just exposed. It was disintegrating in real time. The board members he'd called an hour earlier suddenly couldn't be reached. The administrator he'd blackmailed for 15 years was already on the phone with his lawyer. The private investigator he'd hired to dig into Megan's background had become a liability. His report to Whitfield was now evidence of conspiracy. But that wasn't the moment that ended his career. The moment was when Chen was wheeled into the lobby. He came down in a hospital bed, pushed by 2 orderlies, wearing a patient gown and 4 lines in both arms, but he was awake. Lucid. His eyes tracking the movement in the room with the focus of someone whose mind had finally snapped back into gear after 4 days of chemical fog. When he saw Megan standing with the general and the Marines and the federal agents, something flickered across his face: recognition, gratitude, a kind of gratitude so large it had nowhere to go but up his throat and out into the silent lobby. He raised his tattooed arm, the one with her name inked across his forearm in letters the size of a man's thumb, and his voice cracked like old leather when he spoke. "She took 4 rounds pulling me out." His words carried weight. Tikrit. 3 miles through sniper fire. He swallowed. "I'd be dead in that street." The lobby didn't just go quiet. It transformed into something else entirely, reverent, the kind of silence that only happens when people suddenly understand they've been standing next to a legend and didn't know it. A nurse who'd watched Whitfield throw that chart at Megan's feet was crying silently. The security guard was standing at rigid attention, his hand over his heart. Whitfield's mouth opened. No sound came out. He tried to step backward, but the federal agents had already moved to flank him. His wrists were cuffed before he could speak. They read him his rights in that lobby, surrounded by staff members he'd terrified and patients he'd endangered and the very nurse he'd tried to destroy, who was now standing in her true form, not a nursing assistant being paid poverty wages to infiltrate a fraud ring, but a Master Chief Petty Officer decorated for valor, whose hands had held people together through gunfire and blood and the kind of darkness that changes you forever. The hospital board chair stepped forward with cameras rolling. News crews had somehow arrived within minutes, probably tipped off by naval intelligence, probably ready for this exact moment. "Dr. Whitfield," she said, her voice formal and final, "your employment with St. Michael's Hospital is terminated effective immediately. You are escorted from the premises. Your medical license suspension is pending federal review." They walked him past Megan. He tried to meet her eyes but found only a steady, neutral gaze, the same expression she'd worn when he'd thrown the chart at her feet in the cafeteria, when he'd whispered sweetheart like an insult, when he'd tried to remake her into something small. The expression that said he had never, for a single second, broken her composure. The general presented evidence in a conference room an hour later, but everyone who mattered had already seen the real evidence in Chen's eyes. $12 million in false billing. Kickbacks from 3 pharmaceutical companies whose agents had left traces in Whitfield's email and his bank accounts. Deliberate medication alterations on disabled veteran patients, not just Chen, but 6 others across 2 years. Charts were spread across the table like an autopsy. Prescriptions with falsified dosages. Insurance claims with phantom procedures. The private investigator's notes about Megan's background became exhibits in a federal fraud case. His network of allies didn't just abandon him. They turned on him, suddenly remembering that they'd suspected irregularities, that they'd never fully trusted his methodology, that they'd been planning to review his cases anyway. In the halls of St. Michael's, people who'd laughed at Whitfield's jokes yesterday began discussing whether they'd ever actually liked him at all. Megan was offered a position that afternoon, official liaison between Naval Intelligence and Hospital Administration, tasked with establishing a veteran patient advocacy program, reporting directly to the San Diego Regional Command. She accepted with a single nod. 2 years later, someone spotted Whitfield teaching CPR at a community college in El Centro, 40 miles inland, for $18 an hour. He wore a polo shirt with the college logo and spoke to students in a voice that had lost all authority. His name appeared on federal fraud watch lists. His medical license was permanently revoked. He was teaching basic first aid to adults who made more than he did, and nobody in that community college classroom knew his story, which was exactly what he deserved. But Megan wasn't thinking about him on the afternoon she visited Chen at the VA Rehabilitation Center in La Jolla. She was watching him walk between parallel bars, his legs stronger than they'd been in weeks, his memory returning in fragments like photographs developing in chemical baths. He could remember now, not all of it, not yet, but enough. He remembered Tikrit. He remembered her voice talking him through the pain during those 3 miles, keeping him conscious, keeping him alive with nothing but words and will and hands that refused to let go. They sat in the rehabilitation center's garden where morning glories climbed a wooden trellis and the ocean was visible in the distance like a promise. Her challenge coin hung from a chain around his neck, no longer tarnished but polished bright as starlight, a weight he wore against his chest that meant something now that his mind had returned to claim it. "You stayed," he said. "When they fired you. When they told you the investigation was blown. You stayed in that hospital room anyway." She thought about the diner at 3 in the morning. The cold coffee. The moment she'd almost decided to walk away from everything. "You would have done the same," she said. He took 4 more steps than yesterday. Then 5. His hands gripped the bars with the strength of someone whose body was finally catching up to his determination. At St. Michael's, a plaque hung in the hallway outside the new Veteran Advocacy Office. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, USN. Beneath her name, words from her deposition, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." The disabled Marines in room for 47 and 6 other rooms were never left alone for hours again. Their charts were reviewed weekly. Their medications were supervised by protocols that Megan herself had written. Her hands that had held lives together through gunfire now held the entire system accountable. If you found this story powerful, please subscribe to see more accounts of hidden heroes in plain sight. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value. These stories matter. Share them.